He gave her everything. Not just gifts, not just time. He gave her the version of himself that he'd never shown anyone else. Kevin was the guy who showed up when she was sick, who noticed when she went quiet, who moved his entire schedule around her moods without being asked. For 2 years, he poured himself into that relationship like a man trying to fill an ocean with his bare hands. And then she ended it. Not for someone better, not for someone kinder. She walked toward a guy who could barely keep his phone charged, who forgot plans regularly, who treated her attention like something he could take or leave. Kevin stood there with his whole heart on the floor, wondering what just happened. And the part that really breaks people, she told him later, almost confused by her own words. You were perfect. That was the problem. That right there is what we're pulling apart today. Because if perfect is the problem, we need to understand exactly why. This is Psyche shift, as it's where we go past the surface of human behaviour and find the mechanics underneath. 2 sentences, that's all I'll spend on introductions. Let's get into the real conversation. Nobody talks about this part honestly. Attraction doesn't run on logic. It doesn't reward the man who tries hardest or loves loudest. It runs on something closer to electricity, and electricity needs resistance to flow. Without friction, without some degree of mystery, without the question mark of what is he thinking right now, the current just dies. Psychologists have studied this for decades under the framework of variable reward reinforcement. The short version: the human brain lights up hardest for things it can't fully predict, not things it hates, not things it loves unconditionally, things it's not entirely sure about. The emotional equivalent of a song that drops right when you stop expecting it. When a man makes himself infinitely accessible, answers within 30 seconds, clears every Saturday for her, adjusts his opinions mid-conversation to match hers, he's essentially handed her a remote control to his entire emotional world. And people almost universally get restless when they realize nothing they do changes the signal. The screen is always on, always the same channel. Watch how this plays out with someone like Aaron. 2 years into a relationship, his girlfriend started picking fights about strange things, small things. He thought she was being irrational. What she was actually doing, without knowing it, was testing the frequency. She was turning knobs to see if anything changed. When nothing did, when Aaron just absorbed everything with patient understanding, the restlessness in her grew louder. She told her sister she felt weirdly bored even when things were good. That's not boredom with him. That's what happens when predictability swallows the space where excitement used to live. Now, what's the move here? Keep something for yourself, not as a strategy, not as a manipulation tactic, as a genuine practice of maintaining your own life alongside a relationship, your interests, your opinions, your plans that exist whether she's part of them or not. A man who has his own gravity, who moves through the world with his own direction, is endlessly more compelling than a man who orbits someone else entirely. She should be drawn into your atmosphere, not the other way around. Most men don't realize this is happening in real time. When you place someone above you, treat their needs as more urgent, their feelings as more valid, their preferences as the default, you aren't being loving, you're being self-erasing, and relationships can't survive a long-term imbalance in standing. Not because women don't appreciate kindness, they do, but because respect, the kind that lives in the bones of a relationship, requires that both people feel like they're dealing with an equal. There's a behavioral pattern in psychology sometimes called perceived mate value gap. When one partner consistently signals that the other is out of their league, through over-accommodation, constant flattery, putting up with behavior they'd never accept from anyone else, it creates cognitive dissonance. The brain of the person being idolized starts running a quiet calculation. If he treats me like I'm extraordinary just for existing, either he's right and I'm settling, or he's wrong and something is off about him. Neither conclusion leads anywhere good. What makes this sharper is how it unfolds over time. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments of erosion. He doesn't push back when she's unfair. He over-explains his decisions like he needs her approval. He checks in 3 times when once would have been enough. Each individual moment is tiny, accumulated over months. She stops seeing a partner. She starts seeing someone she has to manage. Take someone like Brennan, smart, emotionally generous, the kind of man who genuinely believed love meant showing up without conditions. His partner used to tell him he was too good for her, which he heard as a compliment. It wasn't. It was an early warning. Because the moment someone says that, they're announcing that the gap between their self-image and how you're treating them has become uncomfortable. And discomfort, left unaddressed, becomes resentment. What actually moves the needle? Own your space. Have a perspective and hold it, even gently. Be someone who can be disagreed with without crumbling. Be someone who occasionally chooses himself without needing to justify at length. Equality in a relationship isn't about keeping score. It's about both people feeling like neither one is carrying the other's emotional weight. That balance is the thing most people describe as chemistry when they look back on their best relationships. Now we go somewhere deeper. Some of the dynamics in this conversation aren't about strategy or attraction theory. They're about history, specifically about what people learned love was supposed to feel like before they were old enough to question it. Attachment research, built largely on the work of psychologist John Bowlby, and later expanded significantly by others, shows that the emotional patterns formed in early childhood become templates, blueprints we carry into adult relationships without ever consciously deciding to. And for someone who grew up in an environment where affection was inconsistent, unpredictable, or conditional, steady and generous love doesn't compute as love. It computes as unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels like danger to a nervous system wired for chaos. Pay attention to what this actually looks like. A woman with this pattern might pull away right after a particularly warm, connected moment. She might start an argument on a night when everything was going well. She might describe a genuinely caring man as too much or suffocating. Not because he crossed a real boundary, but because closeness itself activates old alarm systems inside her. And here's the part that hits hard for men who love deeply. These women are often drawn to nurturing men precisely because they sense that warmth. There's a magnetic pull toward the person who offers what was missing early on. But the tragedy is that receiving what they always needed can also be the most threatening thing. The closer you get, the louder the internal alarm rings. This is why some men experience what feels like being wanted and rejected at the same time. Because they are. Someone like James could tell you about this firsthand. Every time he and his girlfriend reached a new level of genuine closeness, after a vulnerable conversation, after a week where everything felt easy and real, she would create distance, new complaints, sudden coldness. He spent 2 years trying to figure out what he'd done wrong each time. The answer? He hadn't done anything wrong. The closeness itself was the trigger. Understanding this changes everything about how you see the situation. It stops being about what you did or didn't do. It starts being about compatibility, specifically whether someone is in a place to receive the kind of love you're actually offering. The real question to ask yourself early on: how does she handle good? Not conflict, not stress, but genuine, uncomplicated good. If peace makes her uncomfortable, that tells you something crucial that no amount of love on your end can fix for her. Sit with this one for a moment. When someone knows, really knows, that you won't leave no matter what, your love stops being a gift and starts becoming leverage. Not always through conscious calculation, but the effect is the same. This isn't a comfortable thing to say, and it's even less comfortable to recognize when you're inside it. But the behavioral pattern is consistent enough that it's worth naming directly. Once a person discovers that pushing a boundary results in you moving the boundary rather than holding it, they've learned something, and what they've learned tends to get applied again and again. Each time the test gets a little bigger, each time the accommodation required gets a little more costly. Psychologists describe this through the lens of operant conditioning, one of the most reliable mechanisms in all of human behavior. Behavior that gets rewarded continues. When a man responds to unreasonable demands by eventually giving in, when he swallows resentment and keeps the peace at his own expense, he has just taught the relationship what works. Not through anyone's fault, really, just through the mechanics of how behavior gets reinforced. Picture someone like Nolan. 6 months in, his girlfriend would go cold for days whenever he made plans that didn't include her. Not one big blow-up, just slow, sustained emotional withdrawal until he cancelled his plans and stayed. Nolan thought he was being loving. He was actually training both of them into a pattern that made the relationship smaller and smaller until there was no room for him in it at all. The exit from this loop is simpler to describe than it is to live. It requires being willing to sit in discomfort rather than resolve it prematurely with a concession. It means saying calmly and without anger, "I hear you're upset, and I'm still going to do what I planned," not combatively, not coldly. But with the steady assurance of a man who knows that loving someone well doesn't mean letting them rewrite your limits every time they feel uncomfortable. That steadiness, what some psychologists call a non-reactive presence, is genuinely one of the most stabilizing things a man can bring into a relationship. It says without words, "I'm here, I'm solid, and I don't need you to be okay with everything for me to remain okay." Now we turn this around entirely, because every man who has recognized himself in this conversation needs to hear the next part as clearly as possible. Some of what gets called loving too much isn't love at all. It's anxiety wearing love's clothing. There's a difference, a real, felt difference, between a man who gives because he's genuinely secure and generous, and a man who gives because some part of him believes that if he stops, the connection disappears. One is abundance. The other is a quiet, constant negotiation with fear. Men who grew up in homes where affection had to be earned, where stability came and went without warning, where being good enough was always one mistake away from being revoked. Those men often become relationship overachievers. They develop an instinct that says, pour more in, stay more available, never give them a reason to leave. It looks like devotion. It feels like survival. And women can feel the difference even when they can't name it. Receiving love from a secure man feels like standing in sunlight, warm, present, not demanding anything back. Receiving love from an anxious man feels like standing under a spotlight, watched, waited, responsible for managing someone else's need for reassurance. This isn't said to shame anyone, genuinely, because men who developed this pattern usually did it to survive something real. The problem is that what kept the peace in a chaotic childhood becomes the thing that fractures an adult relationship. The work, and it is actual work, is learning to locate your sense of worth somewhere inside yourself rather than in the continuity of the relationship, to be able to say, at a foundational level, if she pulls back, I will be okay. If this ends, I will be okay. I am not okay because she's staying. I am okay because I know who I am. That internal shift doesn't happen from reading one script or watching one video, but it starts with recognizing which kind of loving you've been doing. Let's land this. Everything covered in this conversation points to a single truth. The version of love that costs a man his identity, his boundaries, and his sense of self is not love at its strongest. It is love at its most frightened. The patterns, the constant availability, the stepping down, the absorption of bad behavior, the loss of personal direction, they don't come from too much heart. They come from a man who has made another person's reaction the measuring stick for his own value. And no relationship built on that foundation holds, not because love failed, because the man standing at the center of it got buried in the process of offering it. Women who are genuinely ready for depth, who have done their own work and want a real partnership, do not need you to disappear for them to feel comfortable. They're drawn to a man who holds his shape even when things are hard, who cares without performing it, who shows up consistently, but also shows up as himself. The women whose behavior matches the darker patterns in this conversation, the testing, the pushing, the discomfort with closeness. They aren't villains. They're mostly people running old software on new situations. But understanding that doesn't mean you stay in the loop indefinitely. Compassion for someone's wounds is not the same as volunteering to be wounded by them. Kevin, from the opening story, eventually figured this out. Not quickly, not without real pain. But he came out the other side understanding that his capacity to love deeply was never the flaw. The flaw was in the direction he'd aimed it, at someone who couldn't hold it, toward a version of the relationship that required him to shrink daily to sustain it. Your love, at full strength and full confidence, pointed at someone genuinely capable of receiving it. That's not the problem. That's the whole point. Protect that. Invest it well. If this hit differently than what you usually come across, share it with someone who's currently in the middle of one of these cycles, and drop in the comments as which section caught you off guard. See you next time.